going to have a look at the ending of Mice and Men. And if you're doing this for National 5, the question you're most likely to get will probably start with the words, choose a novel which has a satisfactory ending. And whether or not the ending of Mice and Men is satisfactory depends, I think, primarily on whether or not we're convinced that George has no choice but to shoot his best friend. Because if you believe that he had a choice, then the ending is less appropriate, less fitting. There are some other questions to address, though, here, especially if you're aiming for a top mark. So let's have a look at some of these first things. The basic question that underlies the whole concept of the ending of this novel: does Lennie have to die? And I think it's important here that we remember the setting in terms of time, so the context of it. 1930s California was a very different place from 2017 Britain. We live in a society that, by and large, acknowledges the human rights of everybody, including our criminals, including the right to life and the right not to be subjected to torture. 1930s California was very different. Lennie would almost certainly have been lynched, which was a summary hanging, or he would have been hanged following some kind of investigation into his crime, even if he'd escaped from Curley's determination to shoot him. Even the alternative that Slim suggests is not one that we would suggest nowadays would accord with Lennie's human rights. The themes of the novel also point very strongly to the fact, I believe, that Lennie has to die. When you look at the context of the title, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, and leave us naught but grief for promised joy. That suggests very strongly to me that the intention in Steinbeck's mind is that Lennie has to die so that George's schemes come to nothing, and so do Lennie's. But if we look at some of the details from the novel, could George have helped him escape? Was there an alternative? Candy actually suggests it at the moment that they find Curley's wife's body. We ought to let him get away. And George doesn't even bother to dignify that with a response. He just completely ignores the fact that Candy said it. It's obvious that it's not going to happen. And Candy then goes on to acknowledge that not only is Curley going to want to kill Lennie, but the rest of the guys who work on the ranch are as well. They all seem to have this feeling that Lennie has to die for his crime, and letting him escape isn't the answer. And if George were to help him escape, could George go on the run with him again like he did after Weed? No, I think not. And I think the answer's no for a couple of reasons. One is that they would then both be living as fugitives from the law. They would both have a bounty on their heads. And there's also the moral question of whether or not George can let that happen. Lennie has killed, and the question of whether or not he could do it again if he was left free means that I think George has to accept that this is the end of Lennie's career as a free man. Could he be caught and jailed? Is there an alternative punishment? And that's what Slim suggests. George says, hopefully, maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him, but Slim's definition of them being nice to him is very different. He reckons that if they lock him up, they'll strap him down and put him in a cage. And Slim says that ain't no good, George. And in those words, you feel as though Slim has kind of sealed Lennie's fate. But I would urge you at this point not to forget that by this point in the novel, George has already got Carlson's gun. George's decision is almost completely made at the point that Slim tells him that being locked up and imprisoned as a criminal, as a murderer, isn't a good alternative for Lennie. Does it have to be George? Curley is keen to kill Lennie. Why doesn't George just let him get on with it? Because if George lets him do it, it isn't him that's guilty of killing his best friend. He doesn't carry that burden for the rest of his life. Well, I think there are a couple of reasons why it does have to be George. And the first is that all the way through the novel, Steinbeck is very keen to tell us that George is responsible for Lennie. Lennie is consistently characterised using animal imagery, and the example I've given you here, like a terrier who doesn't want to bring a ball to its master, Lennie approached, and then I think it says something about him backing off before he finally hands the dead mouse over to George. But this simile of Lennie being like a dog coming to its master really does characterise Lennie's relationship with George. He's described as being an animal all the way through. If he's an animal, the corollary of that is that George is his owner, which gives him responsibility for what Lennie does and for Lennie's life. And then there's all the foreshadowing of Lennie's death that occurs around Candy's dog. And it isn't just that Lennie will be shot with the same gun, and concentrating on the back of his head and the point where the skull joins the spine as being the point where you can shoot somebody and it'll be, or an animal, and it'll be painless. But Candy realises that he didn't ought to have let no stranger shoot his dog. And that makes it very clear that George has to take responsibility for shooting Lennie. He didn't ought to let no stranger do it. Lennie is his responsibility and it is his job to do it. The other reason that it has to be George is that the alternative to George is that it's going to be Curley. And Curley's motivation is to make Lennie suffer. Curley wants revenge for his hand as well as for his wife. And Curley is determined to shoot Lennie in the guts. That's a long, slow death. And that's what Curley's determined to do. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself. Even if he then shoots Lennie again and it's over in minutes, it's not the death that George gives him. And George's first instinct is to say, I ain't going to let him hurt Lennie. Whatever happens, George takes responsibility for protecting Lennie, even if the only protection he can give him is a quick death. Slim puts his authority behind George's decision when he says, you had her, George, I swear you had her. Slim has been built up all the way through the novel as the sort of moral arbiter of the ranch. He has godlike authority. There's all sorts that's been attributed to Slim in the way of characteristics that prepare for this moment. When Slim makes this judgment on George, we have to accept it. We have to accept that Slim is right. George had no alternative. It had to be him. Another reason that we have to accept that it's right that Lennie dies, the themes of the novel. Several of the themes of this novel don't come to completion without Lennie's death. The title talks about the best laid schemes of mice and men, and we know that that has to end badly in order for that to be satisfied. And the theme of friendship. The friendship between George and Lennie, which has made them different from all the other men on the ranch, has to end. You could argue the biggest act of friendship of all, that for George to make the sacrifice of his peace of mind for Lennie to have a quick, clean death is a huge sacrifice for him to make. The theme of loneliness is completed as well with the death of Lennie, because George and Lennie have been the only pair all the way through the novel who weren't lonely. When George says, guys like us are the loneliest guys in the world, George is now the loneliest of them all, because he's known something different. So he has joined the ranks of the men that he originally stood above. He now knows from personal experience the loneliness that this novel is built upon. And the theme of dreams. The dream of George and Lennie. You could argue that George's dream wasn't so much the place as the sort of happy state that Lennie was in when it was told. George's dream was that Lennie would be somewhere that he was happy and safe. George's dream ends badly, Lennie's dream ends badly, all the other dreams of the other characters are brought to a rather negative conclusion, but it fits with the pessimism of the novel that the Great Depression and the Great American Dream are destined to end badly. Then when we look at how the ending is fitting for each of these minor characters, Candy and Crooks aren't there at all. They came in on George and Lennie's dream, they've gone out of George and Lennie's dream, and they're no longer present. They're not even there at the very end of the novel. Curley doesn't get the revenge that he so desperately wants, which I think is satisfactory from the reader's point of view, because it was a nasty satisfaction that he would have had, so we're quite glad that he doesn't get it. Slim is there, as we've already discussed, as the sort of moral arbiter that comforts George and gives George the confirmation that he's done the right thing. So Slim is in his right place at the end of the novel. Carlson is given the very last words of the novel. Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys? Carlson, we've already talked about, doesn't have empathy. He is incapable of understanding what George and Slim are feeling at this point in the novel. But it's right that he is given those last words because he is that character that is so very much the typical ranch worker. He is the one who embodies the loneliest guys in the world, so it's right that he gets the last words. Now, having talked about all sorts of reasons why the ending of the novel is satisfactory, I think there is one elephant left in the room that we have to deal with, or perhaps it's the rabbit left in the room. The episode when Lennie is by himself by the river and he hallucinates Aunt Clara and then the rabbit is really problematic. I think there are two reasons that this episode really doesn't work for me. One is that it totally contradicts what George has said earlier in the novel, that Lennie ain't crazy. At this point in the novel, he is delusional, and although you could argue that Aunt Clara and the rabbit are some kind of embodiment of Lennie's interior monologue, I still think the fact that he hallucinates them and Steinbeck describes them in very visual terms as though they are actually present on the riverbank, I find that really problematic. Is Lennie crazy? Has George been wrong all this time? Has George been lying all this time? I find that really hard. The other thing I dislike about it is that all the way through the novel, Steinbeck has adopted this third-person limited narrator persona. So we see the characters, we hear their words, we never actually trespass into their thoughts. We are never given anything that a character is thinking unless they speak it out loud. And now we're not only given Lennie's thoughts, but these thoughts are given this kind of physical projection that just, for me, feels wrong. I think Steinbeck's had to do something a little bit experimental here, and it is the only point in the novel where this happens. And you can see that he's trying to give us a sense of Lennie's interior turmoil. I don't believe that Lennie is capable of constructing a metaphor like the rabbit uses when it says he ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram him into hell. That, for me, doesn't fit with the simplicity of Lennie's understanding of language and his inability to deal with figurative language that you see elsewhere in the novel. So, where do the rabbit and Aunt Clara come from? I don't know. I think you can accept it as being indicative of Lennie being under huge stress, although that doesn't work for me either because Lennie doesn't really understand the magnitude of what he's done. When he picks up the puppy and he says that he's going to throw it away because it's bad enough as it is, I think that shows you that Lennie doesn't understand the magnitude of having killed a woman if he thinks that a dead puppy is going to make it worse. So, Aunt Clara and the rabbit I would kind of deal with as a little bit of a counter-argument if you're saying all the way through an essay that the ending of the novel is satisfactory, because for me that bit isn't satisfactory. The one thing that redeems it really is that as soon as George appears, we revert to the relationship that George and Lennie have had. The imagery and everything else in the narrative perspective are restored. It's a tricky one. And that brings us to the end of the ending. You would need to write a conclusion that pulls it all together and says that in terms of the themes, the minor characters, the moral dilemma that George faces, you believe that the ending of this novel is satisfactory, and possibly simply admit that those things outweigh the question that hangs over the episode of Lennie's hallucination. Good luck.